Have you ever wondered why we are forbidden from asking the simplest, literally childish questions concerning our past? We are told that history is a science of facts, dates, and archaeological findings. But as soon as you pick up a calculator and an 8th grade physics textbook, this entire neat picture of the world, which we've been taught since childhood, begins to crumble into dust. We live amidst scenery whose meaning we have lost. We walk past buildings whose function has been explained to us completely incorrectly, and the most egregious, most obvious fact, which lies on the surface, but which we stubbornly refuse to notice, concerns how our ancestors survived in their lavish palaces. We are told that fierce frosts gripped Russia and Northern Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries. We are told about the Little Ice Age. Yet, the architecture of that era literally screams the opposite. Look at these buildings. Gaze at these gigantic window openings. Floor-to-ceiling windows, enormous doors, ceilings reaching 16 or even 23 feet high. And all of this in a climate where winter temperatures drop to -22 or even -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Do you truly believe these were built by people who planned to heat such vast volumes with firewood? Let's set aside mysticism and engage logic. Imagine the volume of air in a ballroom of a typical estate or palace. That's tens of thousands of cubic feet. Official history claims that all this splendor was heated by fireplaces and stoves. But any heating engineer will tell you that this is physically impossible. A fireplace's efficiency rating is only about 10 or 15%. A fireplace doesn't heat a room. It acts as an extremely powerful exhaust fan. It sucks warm air out of the room and expels it up the chimney, causing cold air from outside to seep in through cracks. To warm a hall 20 feet high with enormous single-pane windows, when the outdoor temperature is -4 degrees Fahrenheit, you wouldn't just need to burn an armful of firewood. You would literally need to burn railway cars full of wood daily. Where are the storage facilities for this coal and firewood? Where are the gigantic boiler rooms that would have been required to service these palaces? They are not present on old plans. They are not in the basements. We are told that they were rebuilt, that they were demolished. But the truth is far more unsettling. These buildings simply were not designed for heating in the way we understand it. Look at old engravings and paintings depicting interiors of that era. Notice the strange dissonance. We see lavish halls, marble statues, light, almost summery architecture, vast, light-filled spaces, and in these halls are people. But how are they dressed? They are wrapped in fur coats, in thick waistcoats. They sit in fur wraps right indoors. Official historians explain this as fashion. Fashion? Seriously? Would you sit in a sable fur coat at the dinner table because it's fashionable? Or because steam is coming out of your mouth? This isn't fashion. This is survival. This is direct proof that the people we call the builders of these palaces were, in fact, merely occupants. They arrived in these cities when they were already standing. They occupied empty, cold shells left by a previous, more advanced civilization and tried to adapt them to their primitive way of life. They didn't know how these walls functioned. They didn't know why these windows were needed. They were simply trying not to freeze. We are dealing with a global falsification of the purpose of architecture. We are told that huge windows were needed for light because there was no electricity. But this is a lie. Enormous windows mean colossal heat loss. With 19th century technologies, and in the absence of sealed, insulated windows, such windows turn a palace into an ice trap. No amount of candles could justify the cold that penetrates through these glass walls. Any architect designing a building for a cold climate knows the rule. Minimize the window area, create vestibules, cut off the cold. And what do we see in so-called classical architecture? Entry doors up to 18 feet high, leading directly outdoors, or into a cold vestibule. No vestibules, no thermal air curtains. This is architecture for the subtropics. This is architecture for a world where there was no winter. Or, this is architecture that utilized a fundamentally different energy source, which we have been ordered to forget. Look at the thickness of the walls. Yes, they are 3 feet thick. Brick has a certain thermal capacity, but without a constant heat source inside, these walls freeze solid in a couple of weeks of severe frosts. And then they start acting like a refrigerator. To warm up a cooled brick mass of such volume, you would need to stoke stoves continuously for a month. Now imagine the logistics. Thousands of carts with firewood would have had to enter city centers daily to provide heat for these palaces. Where are the traces of this logistics? Where are these endless convoys in the engravings? Cities would have been buried under mountains of ash and soot. But in old photographs and paintings, we see clean streets, white snow, and no smoke from chimneys. Indeed, on many buildings, chimneys are either entirely absent or appear as decorative superstructures added later. This is not merely an oddity. This is a technical contradiction that cannot be resolved within the framework of the official version of history. We are forced to believe that our ancestors were idiots who built homes in Siberia and Northern Europe according to Italian designs, ignoring the climate. But our ancestors were not fools. They were masters. This means these buildings were either constructed in a different climate or designed with technologies that we have lost or that were stolen from us. We see traces of a cargo cult. Imagine a savage who found a smartphone. He might use it as a mirror or crack nuts with it, but he doesn't understand how it works. The same thing happened with the so-called nobility of the 18th century. They moved into ready-made palaces, arranged their furniture there, hung carpets on the walls to provide some warmth, and began installing their crude potbelly stoves, breaking through stucco and ceilings to create flues. Have you seen how crudely chimneys are cut into some museum estates? How pipes disfigure facades, passing across windows or decorative elements? This is not a design solution. This is an emergency repair. This is an attempt to survive in conditions for which the building was not adapted. The occupants arrived at ruins. They did not build this world. They inherited it after some catastrophe, and they desperately tried to conceal this fact by rewriting chronicles and inventing fairy tales about great architects who supposedly designed these icy crypts for balls and masquerades. But physics cannot be deceived. The thermal conductivity of materials, the volume of air, and the calorific value of firewood are witnesses that cannot lie. And their testimony completely shatters the official picture of the past. Let's set aside emotions and turn to the dry language of numbers and thermal physics, which demolishes tales of candle-lit balls more effectively than any weapon. Official history tries to convince us that the heating of gigantic palace complexes was done with firewood. We are told, well, they had many servants, a lot of firewood. They simply stoked the stoves around the clock. All right, let's calculate. Let's take a standard grand hall of any administrative building or palace of that era. The area, let's say 2,000 square feet. The ceiling height, a modest 16 feet. That's 32,000 cubic feet of air. Now let's recall thermal conductivity. Single-pane glazing in gigantic windows, no insulation in the walls, enormous gaps in doorways. To maintain a temperature of at least 64 degrees Fahrenheit in such a volume, with an outdoor temperature of minus 13 degrees Fahrenheit, requires a constant thermal power of approximately 100 kilowatts. If we convert this to firewood, considering the monstrously low efficiency of the stoves and fireplaces of that era, the numbers become fantastic. 1 kilogram About 2.2 pounds of dry wood releases a certain amount of heat when burned, but a brick stove absorbs only a small fraction, and a fireplace expels 90% of the heat up the chimney. To heat just one such hall, you would need to burn approximately 110 pounds of firewood per hour. Per hour. That's half a ton of firewood per day for just one room. And in a palace, there are dozens, sometimes hundreds of such rooms. Multiply 1,100 pounds by 50 rooms. We get 25 tons of firewood daily. This is a fully loaded railway car or a procession of 50 peasant carts. Can you imagine this logistics? Every day, an endless caravan of wood would have had to pull up to the main entrance of imperial residences or noble estates. The courtyard would have to be turned into a lumber yard. But where is this in the paintings? Where are the mountains of sawdust, wood chips? Where are the bustling men with axes? They are absent. Around the palaces there is perfect cleanliness, manicured lawns, ladies strolling. We are being lied to directly, shown a picture that is physically impossible. Let's continue. The problem of waste disposal. Burning 25 tons of firewood daily leaves behind tons of ash and coals. Where did all this go? Every day, dozens of baskets of dirty, dusty ash would have had to be carried out of the palace. Imagine this process inside buildings adorned with white marble, silk, and gilding. Soot is a finely dispersed dust. It penetrates everywhere. After a month of such intensive heating, all the stucco, all the paintings, all the tapestries would be covered with a greasy layer of black grime. But restorers, removing layers of paint, find clean, vibrant colors beneath them. These interiors did not experience the soot of wood-burning stoves for centuries, until those very occupants moved in. It was they who began to hack through walls and install their ugly pot-belly stoves, and it was with their arrival that the era of dirt and soot began, which was later shamefacedly painted over. Another killer argument is oxygen. The physics of combustion requires an enormous amount of air. Fireplaces and stoves of such power act like giant pumps. To burn a ton of firewood, you need to pump thousands of cubic meters, tens of thousands of cubic feet of air through the firebox. Where does this air come from? From the room, and it enters the room from outside. This creates a wind tunnel effect. The more intensely you stoke the fireplace, the stronger the icy draft sweeps across the floor from the windows and doors towards the fire. This results in an absurd situation. Your face is burning from the flames, while your back is covered in frost from the draft. Living in such a room in winter is impossible. It's not comfort, it's torture. Architects of the past, if they were truly building this for winter, would have designed a complex system of heated fresh air ventilation. But it's absent. Vent channels in old buildings are arranged as if they were designed for natural air circulation in a warm climate, not for combating Siberian frosts. Look at the contrast with real survival architecture. Look at a peasant's log cabin. There you see the logic of a cold climate. A small log house, tiny windows covered with an ox bladder or mica, a low door, a high threshold to keep the heat in, and a giant Russian stove, on which people sleep, takes up half the house. This is rational. This is built to survive -22 degrees Fahrenheit. And nearby stands a palace with floor-to-ceiling windows, with glass domes, with enfilades of rooms where the wind blows freely. Who in their right mind would build a glass conservatory for human habitation in a high-risk farming zone? It's like living in a tent on Mount Everest. This glaring contrast between folk architecture and so-called elite architecture proves only one thing. These two types of structures belong to different eras and different civilizations. The log cabins were built by those who were surviving here and now. The palaces were built by those for whom the climate was completely different, or by those who possessed technology for flameless heating that did not require burning forests. Pay attention to how stoves are placed in old buildings. They often stand in corners, covering beautiful stucco, disrupting the symmetry of the halls. Chimneys are crudely punched through vaults, sometimes vented through windows. This is a clear sign of a 19th century renovation. The original design of the building did not include these stoves at all. The building was a complete, harmonious organism. Then, new owners arrived, who were freezing. They started putting stoves wherever they could, just to get warm. They didn't understand how the original climate control system worked, which, perhaps, was embedded in the walls themselves, in the metal ties, in the dome structures. We see traces of a panicked adaptation of high-tech housing to primitive wood-burning technologies. It's as if a steam engine were retrofitted into a modern electric car, with the hood cut open for a smokestack. On the outside, it still looks beautiful, but inside, it's ruin and soot. And here we come to the most interesting question. If not firewood, then what? If fireplaces were not originally for burning wood, what were they for? Notice the absence of ash pans in old fireplaces. Notice the metal back walls, adorned with complex ornaments. These are not just decorations. These are elements of a technical device. Official science is silent about this, or mumbles something indistinct about decorative functions. But we know that in architecture, functionalism is always primary. No one would spend tons of cast iron and copper on decor where it's not visible. If the physics of heat loss forces us to doubt the official version, then demography and the mathematics of construction deliver the final blow. We are told that these grandiose cities were erected in the 18th and 19th centuries by the labor of peasants and hired workers. But let's open the statistical reference books of that time. Population density was laughable compared to today. Where did these endless armies of builders, stonecutters, plasterers, and, no less importantly, loggers for heating come from? To build and maintain one such city, like St. Petersburg or Moscow in their pre-revolutionary grandeur, required human resources that simply did not exist in nature. We are told tall tales about thousands who perished in the swamps, but archaeology is silent. Where are the mass graves of these nameless builders? They are absent. This means only one thing. The cities were not built in the timeframes we are given. They were excavated. Look closely at the very first photographs from the mid-19th century. These are unique historical documents that censors simply forgot to destroy or retouch. What do we see in panoramas of Paris, Rome, St. Petersburg, Moscow from the 1850s and 60s? We see empty cities. These are ghost towns. Huge avenues, majestic squares, gigantic cathedrals, and not a soul. A rare carriage, a solitary passerby, as if accidentally wandering into the scenery of a fantasy film. Official science has come up with a ridiculous excuse. Allegedly, the camera exposures were too long, and moving people simply weren't captured. But this is a lie. On these very same pictures, we see clear shadows from trees. We see ripples on the water. We see horses standing still. If there were crowds of people, they would have left at least blurred smudges, ghostly silhouettes. But the streets are pristine. These are cities where no one lives. These are cities waiting for their occupants. We see a clear discrepancy between the scale of the architecture and the number of inhabitants. These cities were designed for millions of people, for giant flows, for different logistics. The few thousand people we see in photographs from the late 19th century look like ants crawling over the ruins of a civilization of giants. They did not build these buildings. They couldn't even properly maintain them. That is why we see shabby plaster, broken roads, and dirt right at the foot of royal palaces in old photos. This is not decline. This is the inability of the new owners to maintain the technological heritage they inherited. They simply occupied the empty rooms, boarded up or bricked up windows to keep out drafts, and started making themselves at home. Now let's return to the technology of heat. If firewood was impossible, and gas and oil were not officially in use yet, how did these buildings function? The answer lies within the walls themselves. When restorers open the masonry of ancient palaces, they often come across a complex system of metal ties. This is a skeleton of high-quality iron or copper permeating the entire building. Staples, ties, entire metal belts hidden inside the brickwork. Officially, we are told, this is for strength. But any modern builder will tell you that metal inside a brick wall in a cold climate is suicide for a building. Metal is a cold bridge. It freezes, condensation forms on it, and water tears the masonry from the inside when it freezes. Inserting so much iron into walls in the conditions of the Little Ice Age is engineering madness. Unless this metal served another function. Imagine that these metal ties are not rebar. They are conductors. What if the walls of palaces worked like giant induction heaters or capacitors? We know that brick and certain types of stone can accumulate a static charge. We know about the piezoelectric properties of granite and quartz. What if the entire structure of the building, the dome, the spire, the metal roof, the internal framework, constituted a single circuit for collecting and distributing atmospheric electricity? That very ether energy that Mendeleev wrote about in his first table, and which was later diligently erased from science. We see traces of a panicked adaptation of high-tech housing to primitive wood-burning technologies. It's like retrofitting a steam engine into a modern electric car, cutting a hole in the hood for a smokestack. On the outside, it still looks beautiful, but inside, it's ruin and soot. And here we come to the most interesting question. If not firewood, then what? If fireplaces were not originally for burning wood, what were they for? Notice the absence of ash pans in old fireplaces. Notice the metal back walls adorned with complex ornaments. These are not just decorations. These are elements of a technical device. Official science is silent about this, or mumbles something indistinct about decorative functions. But we know that in architecture, functionalism is always primary. No one would spend tons of cast iron and copper on decor where it's not visible. If the physics of heat loss forces us to doubt the official version, then demography and the mathematics of construction deliver the final blow. We are told that these grandiose cities were erected in the 18th and 19th centuries by the labor of peasants and hired workers. But let's open the statistical reference books of that time. Population density was laughable compared to today. Where did these endless armies of builders, stonecutters, plasterers, and no less importantly, loggers for heating come from? To build and maintain one such city, like St. Petersburg or Moscow in their pre-revolutionary grandeur, required human resources that simply did not exist in nature. We are told tall tales about thousands who perished in the swamps, but archaeology is silent. Where are the mass graves of these nameless builders? They are absent. This means only one thing. The cities were not built in the time frames we are given. They were excavated. Look closely at the very first photographs from the mid-19th century. These are unique historical documents that censors simply forgot to destroy or retouch. What do we see in panoramas of Paris, Rome, St. Petersburg, Moscow from the 1850s and 60s? We see empty cities. These are ghost towns. Huge avenues, majestic squares, gigantic cathedrals, and not a soul. A rare carriage, a solitary passerby, as if accidentally wandering into the scenery of a fantasy film. Official science has come up with a ridiculous excuse. Allegedly, the camera exposures were too long, and moving people simply weren't captured. But this is a lie. On these very same pictures, we see clear shadows from trees. We see ripples on the water. We see horses standing still. If there were crowds of people, they would have left at least blurred smudges, ghostly silhouettes. But the streets are pristine. These are cities where no one lives. These are cities waiting for their occupants. We see a clear discrepancy between the scale of the architecture and the number of inhabitants. These cities were designed for millions of people, for giant flows, for different logistics. The few thousand people we see in photographs from the late 19th century look like ants crawling over the ruins of a civilization of giants. They did not build these buildings. They couldn't even properly maintain them. That is why we see shabby plaster, broken roads, and dirt right at the foot of royal palaces in old photos. This is not decline. This is the inability of the new owners to maintain the technological heritage they inherited. They simply occupied the empty rooms, boarded up or bricked up windows to keep out drafts, and started making themselves at home. Now let's return to the technology of heat. If firewood was impossible, and gas and oil were not officially in use yet, how did these buildings function? The answer lies within the walls themselves. When restorers open the masonry of ancient palaces, they often come across a complex system of metal ties. This is a skeleton of high-quality iron or copper permeating the entire building. Staples, ties, entire metal belts hidden inside the brickwork. Officially, we are told, this is for strength. But any modern builder will tell you that metal inside a brick wall in a cold climate is suicide for a building. Metal is a cold bridge. It freezes, condensation forms on it, and water tears the masonry from the inside when it freezes. Inserting so much iron into walls in the conditions of the Little Ice Age is engineering madness. Unless this metal served another function. Imagine that these metal ties are not rebar, they are conductors. What if the walls of palaces worked like giant induction heaters or capacitors? We know that brick and certain types of stone can accumulate a static charge. We know about the piezoelectric properties of granite and quartz. What if the entire structure of the building, the dome, the spire, the metal roof, the internal framework, constituted a single circuit for collecting and distributing atmospheric electricity? That very ether energy that Mendeleev wrote about in his first table, and which was later diligently erased from science. In such a system, the walls would heat up from within, radiating soft infrared heat evenly. They wouldn't need radiators. The building itself was one big radiator. This explains the absence of soot, the absence of coal storage, the gigantic windows. Heat loss is not frightening if energy is free and limitless, and the light clothing of people in paintings. They lived in a warm field generated by the house itself. But then there was a malfunction, a catastrophe, a war, a pole shift, call it what you will. The energy source dried up or was shut off. The generation stations, which we now call cathedrals and temples, stopped working. The buildings cooled down, and into this cold, dead world came survivors or new colonists. They didn't understand why there was iron in the walls. They simply saw cold stones, and they began to build stoves. It is this moment of transition from a high-tech civilization to a civilization of fire and smoke that we accept as the history of architecture. And one more fact that cannot be ignored: the so-called cultural layer. Go up to any palace or old building in the city center. Look down. You will see windows that go into the ground. We are told, well, the cultural layer grew, people littered, asphalt was laid on top of asphalt. Seriously? Do you believe that the ground level rose by 10 to 13 feet, which is a full story, because street sweepers didn't do their job well? This is absurd. For the ground level to rise by 3 feet, it would take centuries of not removing manure and garbage. But these are emperors' palaces. Sidewalks were washed with soap there. There is no cultural layer. There are consequences of a catastrophic flood, a mudslide, that very clay rain or mud flood that buried the first floors of buildings all over the world. Excavating these buildings today, we find full-fledged doors, windows with frames and glass, leading into dense clay. Who builds a window in a basement that abuts the ground? No one. These were the first floors. And what we consider basements now were technical levels. And perhaps it was there, at depth, buried in clay, that the very installations were located that powered the atmospheric heating system. We walk on the roofs of a buried civilization, trying to warm ourselves by a campfire in the attic of a skyscraper, and call it progress. We are accustomed to thinking that the world is divided by borders, cultures, and eras. We are told that Russia means wooden architecture, America means wigwams and cowboys, and Australia means convicts and kangaroos. But as soon as you open old photo albums of 19th century cities, this illusion of diversity crumbles. You will see the same picture everywhere. Melbourne, San Francisco, Omsk, Kyiv, Cape Town, Buenos Aires. The same ancient architecture stands everywhere. The same columns, the same porticos, the same gigantic windows, the same domes. This is a unified architectural standard that covered the entire planet. Official history tries to explain this as a fashion for classicism. But think for a second. To build such buildings in a wild steppe, or at the edge of the world, where the first ships with convicts had only just arrived yesterday, requires a powerful industrial base. It requires brick factories, quarries, metallurgy, design institutes, roads. We are told that these were built by people with picks and shovels who had barely managed to land on shore. Look at photographs of San Francisco before the earthquake, or panoramas of early Melbourne. These are giant cities, completely built of stone. And this was supposedly done by people who came to pan for gold and herd sheep? This is a lie that insults common sense. These cities stood there long before the arrival of the so-called colonizers. But the most terrifying thing is not even that. The most terrifying thing is the climatic mismatch. This architecture, which we call ancient, is perfectly suited for a warm, mild climate, for eternal summer. Huge windows, open terraces, flat roofs, absence of thermal vestibules. This is the architecture of a world where there was no winter. And this world existed quite recently. A global catastrophe, concealed under terms like Little Ice Age or local floods, changed everything. A pole shift, the impact of a celestial body, or the use of super powerful weapons, We don't know the exact cause, but we see the consequences. The climate changed dramatically. Where gardens bloomed yesterday, today 40-degree below zero frost struck. Permafrost covered vast territories, instantly freezing mammoths with green grass in their stomachs. And in the same way, it froze these majestic cities. Palaces turned into icy crypts. Beautiful fountains were shattered by ice. People who survived this hell were trapped. They had walls, but no heat. They had technology, but the energy source was cut off. It was then that the era of occupants began. Those who survived, or those who came to the liberated territories, began a struggle for survival. They bricked up giant window openings, leaving small vents. Look at old buildings in the center of any Russian city. You will see traces of this barbaric reconstruction. Arches are bricked up, windows reduced by 2/3. They chipped off stucco to run pipes. They built wooden barracks inside stone halls to heat at least some volume of air. We live in the remnants of a civilization that did not know what winter was. And that is why we feel so uncomfortable in our cities. We feel this dissonance on a subconscious level. And now, remember the clay. Clay is the main witness to the crime. All over the world, the first floors of buildings are buried under several feet of clay. We are lied to about the cultural layer, but clay is not garbage. Clay is the result of a powerful hydro impact, a mudslide that swept across continents, sweeping away everything in its path and covering cities in mud. The clay flood is not a theory, it is a fact that you can touch. Go down into any old basement, you will see full-fledged windows, doors, arches that lead to nowhere, into a wall of soil. Why build a grand entrance underground? No one built it there. That was the first floor. Cities were covered by a wave of mud, and the occupants simply did not and could not dig it out. They leveled the roads over the second floor, making it the first. This explains why, in many cities, entire floors with shops, paved streets, and tunnels are found underground. These are not secret bunkers. This is the old standard of living. We literally walk on the heads of our ancestors. The catastrophe destroyed billions. Those very empty cities in photos from the mid-19th century are cities after a cleansing. Humanity was thrown back thousands of years in development. We lost technologies of flameless energy. We lost etheric navigation. We lost medicine and longevity. And what did the new rulers of the world do? They didn't tell the truth, because the truth would provoke fury and bitterness. They invented a history of progress. They told us that we evolved from apes and gradually became smarter, inventing the wheel, then the steam engine, then the iPhone. This is the most brazen lie in history. We are not developing. We are degenerating. We use the pathetic remnants of former greatness without even understanding the principles of their operation. We burn oil and coal, the blood and flesh of the earth, to heat homes that were once heated by ether. We treat the symptoms of diseases, although we once knew how to regenerate organs. We have been turned into livestock, living in a pen built by gods, believing that we built this pen ourselves. The elites who rewrote history know the truth. They know that these buildings are technical devices. They know that beneath layers of clay lie mechanisms capable of changing the world. But they don't need free, creative people. They need consumers who pay for heat, for light, for food. It is profitable for them to keep us cold and ignorant. Look at Piranesi's engravings. Many consider them fantasies. But what if they are a documentary record of ruins immediately after the catastrophe? Gigantic ruined vaults, tiny people bustling in the mud, vegetation breaking through the stones. This is a chronicle of the apocalypse that wiped a unified ancient civilization from the face of the earth. And we are the descendants of those who survived in these ruins, or those who seized them. We look at these palaces with longing, because our genetic memory screams, "This is your home, but you were driven out of it." We feel that we have been deceived. And this cold that chills us to the bone in ancient halls with high ceilings is not just air temperature. It is the cold of oblivion. This feeling of a foreign home never leaves us, precisely because the habitat itself has come into conflict with our biology. Piranesi's engravings and the ruinists of the 18th century left us not just art, but blueprints of a crime scene. They captured the moment when the old world had already perished, and the new one had not yet even learned to clean up the giant's mess. Look at these arches overgrown with bushes, at these colossal vaults under which people dry laundry and cook gruel. This is not the romance of decline. This is documentary evidence that we are a scavenger civilization. We live on the corpse of a great era, using its bones as building material, but completely failing to understand how the living organism functioned. And this cold, permeating the palaces, is the phantom pain of an amputated technology. We are cold not because it is winter outside. We are cold because we lost the atmospheric electricity that heated these walls as naturally as the sun heats the earth.